Lynette White was a beautiful young woman from Cardiff, Wales, who was doing what she believed she had to do in order to get by. She dropped out of school and had been working as a prostitute since she was 14. Being a sex worker wasn't part of Lynette's childhood dream. Weeks before she was found dead, Tim Rogers, a BBC Wales journalist, interviewed her while investigating child prostitution. During the interview, she told Tim how she was drugged, taken to Bristol by a gang of men, and forced into prostitution. Yet even after Lynette found her way back to Cardiff, she could not find her way out of prostitution. By 1988, Lynette, who was now 20 years old, was working the streets daily as a prostitute. Described as popular and pretty by friends, Lynette was probably the most visible prostitute working in Cardiff at the time. She was the first girl to be out at lunchtime and would be the last to leave at night. Working every day, rain or shine, even on Christmas, earning £100 per night. One would almost think White was working hard to have a better life. But that was not the case. It was all to pay for her boyfriend, Stephen Miller's cocaine addiction. Every night, Miller took £60 to £90 from Lynette, who was his only source of income. Lynette lived with Miller in a flat on Dorset Street in Cardiff. Each day, Miller would drive her to Riverside in Cardiff, where she worked, and meet her later in the evening at the North Star Club to collect her earnings. It continued like that every day until February 9, 1988 was the last day Miller saw Lynette. She had not made contact with Miller or her friends in the days leading up to her death, which was very odd behavior for her. She was also due to make an appearance as a witness for 2 prosecution trials when she disappeared. No one knows the reason why White stopped contacting others 5 days prior to her death. The police thought she was deliberately hiding to avoid giving evidence and began to actively search for her. Earlier that same month, Leanne Vilday, Lynette's friend, had loaned Lynette her keys to a flat for the purpose of taking clients there for sex. On February 14, 1988, in the evening, Leanne, who probably wanted to use the flat, went there but found it locked, which was quite unusual. Lynette was nowhere to be found. Leanne became very worried about Lynette. She drove to Butte Town Police Station to report her friend's disappearance. She returned to a James Street flat with 3 policemen who were expecting to serve an arrest warrant on Lynette and take her in. The policemen forced entry into the apartment and found Lynette lying there, in a pool of her own blood. A missing witness found dead with massive injuries. Who murdered Lynette White? According to the autopsy performed by pathologist Bernard Knight, Lynette had been stabbed over 50 times on her chest, face, stomach, wrist, breasts, arms, hams, and inner thighs. Her throat was also savagely slit from ear to ear. Though she was stabbed multiple times, the autopsy revealed that Lynette died from the throat injury. The pathologist also determined that Lynette was murdered on February 14th between 1:45 a.m. and 4:00 a.m. Lynette's body was found between the foot of the bed and the window, covered in blood. Azoospermic semen, which is semen containing no sperm, was found in her vagina and also under underwear. There were 2 different blood types found on Lynette, her own blood and an AB type blood, which did not belong to Lynette. Soon the news about Lynette's death had spread, and police began to ask questions about the incident. Witnesses told the police that they saw a man looking distressed in the area where Lynette's body was found on James Street. The man looked very suspicious, and he appeared to have blood on his hands. The suspicious man, described as a white male, approximately 5'8" to 5'10", and in his mid-30s, became the primary focus of the investigation. Efforts to find this man were exhaustive. Soon they arrested a man that matched the suspect's description, but he was soon released after Police looked into Miller, Lynette's boyfriend, as the partner of a murder victim is usually the first obvious suspect. Miller was questioned but later released because his blood type didn't match the one found on Lynette. Because Lynette was supposed to appear as a witness against a man named Francine Cordell in court, Francine and his mother were investigated, but soon the two were eliminated as suspects because their blood also did not match the AB blood type found on Lynette. Very little is known about the case against Cordell or the other case that Lynette was set to give evidence in. Another suspect that piqued the investigators' interest was a man who was on a list of 12 persons of interest in the area due to their past criminal activity. He was a sex offender and a pedophile who lived close to James Street. His identity was concealed, and he was called Mr. X. When Mr. X was interviewed, he admitted to paying Lynette for sex in the past and was unable to account for his whereabouts at the time of the murder. Mr. X had blood type AB, which prompted the police to run a DNA test on him. When the results came back, it eliminated Mr. X from the investigation. Now, all that the police were left with were statements gathered from their door-to-door inquiry. Gromick, who lived in the flat right above where Lynette was murdered, together with his friend Atkins, gave statements implicating each other in their accounts. But as the statements contained 4 completely different accounts, the investigators didn't take it seriously. Ronnie Williams, a police informant, also gave an account implicating his common-law brother-in-law, Yusuf Abdullahi. He initially claimed Abdullahi knew the killer and later implicated him directly, saying Abdullahi was the killer. It was known to the police that the two detested each other, so again, investigators dismissed the account. Leanne Vilday, who reported Lynette's disappearance on the day she died, was also suspected and questioned. The police visited her daily to question her. The pressure was becoming too much for her to handle, and one day, while she was drunk, she named Miller and Abdullahi as the killers. Violet Perriam, a secretary at the Cardiff Yacht Club, also gave a statement about the incident. 8 months into the investigation, she came forward claiming that on February 14th, while driving home from the club at about 1:30 a.m., she saw 4 excited black males outside the building where Lynette was killed. She then identified 2 of them as John Actie and Rashid Omar. Perriam's statement would give the case a new direction. Angela Sala, who is mildly mentally retarded, also gave a statement that she saw Miller, John Rashid, Ronnie Acton, John's cousin, Tony Paris, and Tony Brace outside 7 James Street on the day Lynette was murdered. This was exactly what police needed, as her account corroborated Perriam's statement. Further implicating Abdullahi, John, Miller, and the rest were Gromick and Atkins, who gave new statements on the same day with Sala. They said they also saw a group of men, including Ronnie and Abdullahi. Sala then gave another statement in December 1988 that she heard a scream from Lynette's flat and rushed there with Vilday. Coincidentally, on the same day, Vilday also told the police that she went to the flat after she heard Lynette scream and met Miller, Abdullahi, Ronnie Actie, Miller's brother, and an unnamed mixed-race man. Unfortunately for Sala, she had an AB blood type. Police insisted that her blood was found on Lynette's socks. She then gave a new statement, but she was part of the killing together with Vilday and the other guys. Vilday also admitted that she was forced to cut Lynette's wrist to ensure her complicity and silence. Miller confessed to killing Lynette after 307 denials. He also implicated the other men named, which led to the arrest of all the men allegedly involved in the murder. On December 7, 1988, the police arrested Stephen and Tony Miller, Yusuf Abdullahi, Ronnie Actie, Rashid Omar, and Martin Tucker. On December 9, 1988, John Actie and Tony Paris were also arrested. For close to a year, they were locked up until their trial began on October 5, 1989 at Swansea Crown Court. This trial became the longest murder trial in British legal history, lasting 197 days. After spending 2 years in custody, Ronnie and John Actie were acquitted of the murder, while Tony Paris, Stephen Miller, and Youssef Abdullahi were found guilty. Each were sentenced to life imprisonment, and since then, they're known as the Cardiff III. Even though no forensic evidence linked these men to the crime scene, they were held as the criminals. However, there were a lot of doubts and questions about the convictions. Consequently, the friends and families of the Cardiff III began a campaign to overturn the convictions. The campaign received massive support and was followed by television documentaries in 1992. By December 1992, the Cardiff III's appeal was heard. After the Court of Appeal had listened to Miller's interrogation, Lord Taylor said the police had bullied Miller during the interview. I'm not involved, I'm not involved. Oh, why is everybody? I don't know, I don't even young, and I know, as I said, I don't know what it was for. Therefore, the truthfulness of Miller's admission was irrelevant. The Cardiff III were free at last. Their convictions were declared unsafe and unsatisfactory by Lord Taylor. But if the Cardiff III didn't commit the crime, it means the real criminal was still roaming free. It brings us to yet the same question. Who murdered Lynette White? 8 years later, the case was reopened. This time, Professor Dave Barkley and Chief Superintendent Kevin O'Neill were assigned to the task. The case took the officers back to the crime scene. By then, it was already 12 years since the incident happened. While examining the old crime scene photographs, Professor Barkley's eyes caught something that no one else saw in all these years. It was a large drop of blood believed to have been thrown from a knife onto the wallpaper. When the crime was committed in 1988, police removed lots of wallpaper in the flat to be stored as evidence. Upon searching through the old wallpaper evidence, they discovered that the only missing piece of wallpaper was the one that contained the large drop of blood. The forensic scientist didn't give up, though. He continued to study the crime scene photos and realized the blood could have dropped on the skirting board beneath. Underneath several layers of paint, the team found the blood completely sealed in and dry. Traces of the blood were also found on a piece of cellophane wrapper from a cigarette pack. Since then, the detectives and scientists dubbed the suspect Cellophane Man. The forensics team, led by Angela Gallup, got to work. But shockingly, the DNA profile was not found in any of the 140 police databases. But when the police searched for similar profiles, it was narrowed to just hundreds in the Cardiff area. Using the approach of familial DNA searching, a partial match was eventually made with the profile of a 14-year-old boy. This boy was known to the police as he was once arrested for joyriding in Cardiff. But could he be the Cellophane Man? If you thought about his age, then your guess was right. He wasn't even born when the incident happened. At that time, the case was 15 years old. Notwithstanding, the police had to visit his house. When they got there, they were told that the boy's father was dead, but he had an uncle, Jeffrey Gafoor. On February 26, 2003, detectives pulled up at Jeffrey's home, a semi-detached house in the village of Llanharan, 15 miles west of Cardiff, but no one was home. The following day, they checked at Jeffrey's place of work, an office block in Cardiff city centre where he worked as the security guard. When the police explained the reason for their visit, Jeffrey said, "Oh, I thought you got some guys for that." He was asked to provide a mouth swab and he complied. Immediately, police checked the swab. They had finally caught the Cellophane Man. Chief Superintendent Kevin O'Neill was determined to do things right this time. He put a surveillance team on Jeffrey while he made preparations for the interview. Chief O'Neill had plans to put surveillance on Jeffrey for a whole week. But on February 28, 2003, Jeffrey made a crazy move. The surveillance team spotted him at a garage where he bought 3 packets of paracetamol, an over-the-counter pain reliever. By the time the police got to Jeffrey's house, he had taken about 62 paracetamols. Jeffrey denied ever taking those tablets, but he announced, "Just for the record, I did kill Lynette White." I've been waiting for this for 15 years. Whatever happens, I deserve it. I sincerely hope to die." He was taken to the hospital where he told a staff member that he was being watched because of a murder he committed 15 years ago. Jeffrey was prepared to die as he initially refused to be treated. He eventually agreed to take an antidote. Within a few days, he had recovered. On July 4, 2003, Jeffrey pleaded guilty to Lynette White's murder, and the judge, Justice Royce, sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 12 years and 8 months. Jeffrey's barristers said Jeffrey killed Lynette over 30 pounds for sex. He said Jeffrey wanted his money back when he changed his mind. In February 2007, Atkins, Sela, Vilde, and Gromick were charged with perjury. By December 2008, Sela, Vilde, and Gromick were found guilty and sentenced to 18 months of imprisonment each. Atkins was exempted because it was believed that he was believed threatened, abused, and manipulated to admit to false accounts suggested to him. In March 2009, it was announced that there was enough evidence to prosecute the police officers involved in the initial investigation with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. In 2011, the trial collapsed due to missing evidence. In 2015, 8 of the 15 charged officers cleared of perverting the course of justice launched a high court civil action against the force, suing for malicious prosecution, false imprisonment, and misfeasance. But at the end of 2015, the judge in the civil action dismissed their case. The 5 falsely accused men were compensated after their release. Stephen Miller was paid £571,000. John Actie was paid £300,000, while Tony Paris was paid £250,000. Rowan Actie died in 2007 after much struggle to cope with what had happened to him. Yusuf Abdullahi also died in 2011 of perforated cancer. He too had battled with post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's it on the Lynette White case. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. The Irene Cortez case, an unfortunate accident or a contracted murder of a mother of many. They say a scorned woman is capable of unpredictable and desperate acts, with cold and cruel revenge being the most fearsome. But what about a scorned man? Many would say an offended man might resort to physical violence, drown his sorrows in alcohol, or combine these two scenarios. Yet men, generally less grudge-holding, can be more ingenious when it comes to revenge. The case of Irene Cortez, a Spanish citizen who met a mysterious end during a trip to Colombia, is complex and ambiguous. While her perpetrators were caught, convicted, and are currently serving long sentences, the deceased woman's family claims the real culprit remains at large and is portraying himself as a victim. Let's delve into this intricate story from the beginning and try to determine if a third party was involved, or if the murder was, indeed, unintentional. It's worth noting that each party involved is still trying to prove their version of the truth. Who was Irene Cortez? Irene Cortez, born Lucas, was born in 1980 in sunny Granada, Spain, the capital of the province of the same name. She grew up in a well-off family with a brother and sister. Her parents ran a small but profitable business. According to some reports, her father passed away early, but her mother, Maria Lucas, took over the business operations, expanded the enterprise, and ensured her children lacked for nothing. Maria's older brother, Uncle Pedro Lucas, was also a significant help. Irene was the eldest of the 3 children. A beautiful and sociable girl, she loved being the center of attention and attracted boys from an early age. Shortly after finishing school, she married and was already pregnant. At 17, she became a mother for the first time, and 2 years later, she had her second child. Her mother and uncle provided considerable support, allowing her to pursue a good education despite early motherhood. In the early 2000s, Irene moved to the resort city of Malaga with her husband and 2 children. There, she opened an entertainment venue that quickly became popular and profitable. Initially a small disco bar, it eventually transformed into a full-fledged nightclub. In Malaga, the couple welcomed their 3rd child, and life seemed prosperous and stable. At 25, Irene's husband was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for trafficking illegal substances. Tragically, he lost his life in prison under mysterious circumstances. The responsibility of raising the children fell solely on Irene's shoulders. Remembering how her mother single-handedly raised 3 children, Irene was determined to persevere. She successfully managed her business, earned well, and had big plans for the future. Relationship with Farid Henessaris. Farid Henessaris, a native of Barranquilla, Colombia, was born in 1976. Growing up in a large, impoverished family, he was the youngest of his siblings. His parents separated in the early 90s when he was still a teenager. His older siblings were independent by then, and Farid stayed with his mother. In 2001, at 25, Farid, along with his elderly mother, moved to Spain in search of a better life. They settled in Malaga, where Farid took any job he could to support himself and his mother. In 2005, he started working as a waiter at a nightclub owned by Irene. Irene immediately noticed Farid's hard work and reliability. She was also attracted to him, and Farid in turn did his best to please her. At the time, Irene's husband was incarcerated, and she planned to file for divorce but couldn't before her husband's untimely demise. Irene and Farid's employer-employee relationship soon blossomed into romance. Farid wasn't deterred by Irene's 3 children from previous relationships, nor was Irene bothered by Farid's humble background as a waiter whose salary she paid. Within months of starting their relationship, the couple decided to move in together. They settled in Irene's spacious apartment, and soon after, Irene became pregnant with Farid's child. They went on to have 2 children together. It's unclear if they were officially married, but Irene kept her first husband's surname, while the children born with Farid carried the Henessaris surname. Imprisonment and infidelity. In 2009, Irene's past seemed to repeat itself. Like her first husband, Farid was arrested for distributing illegal substances and sent to prison. Once again, Irene was left alone, this time with 5 children. Farid was sentenced to 3 years, but served only 1.5, being released early for good behavior and cooperation with the investigation. However, soon after Farid's imprisonment, Irina found solace in the arms of another man and lived with him for those 1.5 years. Farid learned of her infidelity only after his release. Understandably furious, he threatened Irene and her lover and almost attacked the man, narrowly avoiding another legal issue. Eventually, they resolved the matter peacefully. Farid forgave Irene for the sake of their children, and they resumed living together as if there had been no imprisonment or infidelity. Irene's relatives were always skeptical about Farid. Her mother and uncle disapproved of their relationship, suspecting Farid was only interested in Irene's money. Also, Irene's older children from her first marriage never accepted Farid, while the youngest, whom Farid had raised since the child was 2, saw him as a father figure. Fateful trip to Colombia. In early 2011, Irene's husband, Farid, expressed the need to visit his homeland of Colombia due to his father's severe illness. Reportedly, Farid's estranged father was diagnosed with advanced cancer, and his sister in Barranquilla had informed him of the dire situation. Irene, who had long wished to visit Farid's homeland, decided to accompany him. She was eager to meet Farid's father, whom she had never met, and also experience the legendary Barranquilla Carnival, typically held in late February. Moreover, Irene, who hadn't taken a vacation for years due to her dedication to work and raising her 5 children, saw this trip as an opportunity for a much-needed break. The couple planned a 10-day trip across the ocean, with Irene's mother and younger sister agreeing to care for her children during this period. Despite her mother, Maria Lucas's attempts to dissuade her from the journey due to a bad premonition, Irene disregarded her concerns. At the same time, the family faced financial difficulties due to a seasonal downturn in their business. Despite this, Irene had personal savings of €3,000 in cash hidden at home. But on the eve of their trip, she discovered the money had mysteriously vanished, almost derailing their plans. Irene quickly borrowed the necessary funds from her uncle and close friends. She also booked their flight tickets and a hotel in the city center, thoroughly preparing for a journey that, tragically, would be her last. Mysterious murder. On February 27, 2011, the couple arrived in Colombia. The flight was uneventful, and they immediately checked into their hotel. Irene called home to reassure her mother. However, 2 days later, Farid informed Irene's eldest son, 14, of his mother's death. Initially, Farid claimed an accident, but it was soon revealed that Irene was murdered during a robbery at a Barranquilla entertainment venue. The case quickly became a major news story in Colombia. The narrative was that Irene, a Spanish tourist, was killed by robbers who fled the scene, triggering a citywide police manhunt. However, the circumstances of the robbery and murder seemed unusual and suspicious. The attackers did not appear to be trying to steal anything, but instead shot Irene in the heart and then fled in haste. Police and local media representatives quickly arrived on the scene. Despite the fact that Farid witnessed the shooting of his partner during an interview with journalists, he looked quite calm, not corresponding to the image of a grief-stricken widower. The Spanish embassy in Bogotá confirmed the murder, adding that Irene's remains will be repatriated after the necessary investigations. The exact events of the night of March 2nd have yet to be clarified by investigators. In the meantime, authorities are actively pursuing the attackers responsible for this senseless crime. Surveillance footage. The case of Irene Cortez's mysterious death seemed to gain clarity after reviewing surveillance footage from cameras installed at the location where the murder occurred. On March 1st, Irene and her partner, Farid Genasaris, had planned to meet Farid's brother, his sister, and their spouses. The group of 6 enjoyed the carnival, walked around town, and then, at Farid's suggestion, went to a local bar for dinner and entertainment. By 1 a.m., Irene, Farid, and his relatives were the only customers at the bar, as surveillance footage clearly shows. Around 2 a.m., 2 young men sitting away from the group entered the bar. They did not order anything and did not look comfortable, which caught the attention of the bar manager because of their suspicious behavior. Moreover, their young appearance made the manager check whether they were of legal age. The young men refused to show their IDs and, when asked to leave, one of them pulled out a gun and aimed it at the manager. His accomplice produced a knife, but soon retreated out of the camera's view. The armed assailant pushed the manager aside and approached Irene's table, announcing a robbery and demanding mobile phones and cash. His knife-wielding partner reappeared, presumably to collect valuables while the gunman kept the group under threat. However, he didn't get a chance to act. Confronting Irene, the gunman ordered Farid to stand for a pocket search. As Irene reached for her purse, the assailant lunged at her with the same hand holding the gun. A shot was fired as he grabbed the purse, striking Irene directly in the chest. She collapsed to the floor as the assailants fled without taking anything. Farid and his brother chased after them while his sister tried to stop Irene's bleeding, and his brother's wife called for emergency services. Unfortunately, the culprits were too fast to catch. The men returned to the bar, attempting to aid Irene, but it was too late. Emergency responders arrived quickly, yet Irene succumbed to her injuries en route to the hospital, leaving behind a baffling case and a grieving family. The hunt for the perpetrators, arrest and trial. In the wake of the robbery and homicide that took Irene Cortez's life, law enforcement mobilized all available resources. The city was teeming with tourists for the carnival, and ensuring their safety was paramount. A reward of 10 million pesos, about 3,500 euros, was announced for information leading to the culprits. The first suspect, the gunman Brian Dario, was apprehended the next day. He quickly implicated his accomplice, Juan Carlos. Juan, 18, surrendered to authorities, hoping for leniency. During interrogation, Dario claimed dire financial straits, debts, and a sick child in need of costly treatment drove him to the crime, corroborated later by his relatives. He maintained that Irene's shooting was accidental, occurring while trying to snatch her purse. Juan Carlos contended he was an unwitting participant. He said Brian didn't reveal his plans but asked for backup in a job. He claimed to have only a small knife for intimidation, not harm, and left the scene once he realized Brian's intentions. However, surveillance footage contradicted his claims, showing him returning to Brian. With both perpetrators in custody and their confessions, the case appeared solved, with prison sentences looming. The court found Dario guilty of robbery and homicide under aggravating circumstances, sentencing him to 23 years. Carlos received 17 years for complicity in these crimes. Accusations against Farid and new crime details. From the early stages of the investigation, the family of the deceased woman openly accused Farid of orchestrating the murder of his wife. Irene's mother and uncle hired a detective who conducted an independent investigation, gathering additional materials and evidence to hold the man accountable and prove his involvement in the crime. Starting with the earlier mentioned disappearance of €3,000 from the hiding place in Cortez's house. According to Maria Lucas, only Farid knew about this money, and he was the only one who could have discreetly taken it. The woman told her daughter about this from the beginning, but she did not want to listen. Now, she believed that her son-in-law used this money to pay Dario to kill his wife. Another weighty argument was the fabricated illness of the man's father, whom he was so eager to visit. It turned out that no cancer diagnosis was made for the elderly parent, and he was quite healthy for his age. Farid concocted this story, making it the main pretext for the trip to Colombia. Also, it was Genesaris who initiated the visit to that fateful establishment. Moreover, he insisted on continuing the feast deep into the night when all the other visitors had long dispersed, and their company was alone in the hall. Further, the detective conducted a detailed analysis of those very recordings from the cameras, giving an assessment of what was happening and making his own conclusions. He noticed that the criminals acted strangely. Juan was clearly scared and most likely really did not understand what was happening while Brian approached the company, came up to Farid and raised him, but did not directly threaten him with a gun. It looked like the men knew each other and acted cohesively. Then Farid, strangely, moved behind Irene, who was sitting at the table. When she reached into her bag to get her wallet, the criminal with the gun looked at the man as if waiting for a signal. It's hard to say exactly whether he received any kind of sign, as the victim and her husband were back to the camera. After the shot, the man chased the killer, but, in the expert's opinion, he deliberately let him escape. However, the latter statement can be considered controversial, as Brian was armed with a gun and Farid could reasonably fear for his life. Also in question was the man's behavior after his chosen one was declared dead. He willingly gave interviews to the arrived correspondents, talked about the details of what happened, and, at the same time, did not look too upset or depressed. Another important question: why, after the tragedy, did Genesaris call not Irene's mother, not her uncle, or any of the adult relatives, but dialed the number of her 14-year-old son to tell him about his mother's death? According to Maria Lucas, he wanted to personally inflict pain on the teenager, punishing him for not recognizing the stepfather's authority and treating him disrespectfully. The woman's uncle was the first to dare to give an interview in the press and openly talk about his suspicions and the results of the investigation. Pedro Lucas was sure that Farid planned the trip in advance, essentially luring Irene into a trap. The money stolen from her was used to pay for the services of a hired killer, and after her death, he planned to establish guardianship over the children and take over the business of his deceased wife. Farid's mother did not silently listen to her son being accused of a terrible crime and openly stood up for her offspring. The woman claimed that her offspring was madly in love with Irene and her children and would never harm her. However, in the end, the parent inadvertently let slip a phrase about the chosen one not having to cheat on Farid, as this greatly offended his pride. Also, an unpleasant detail emerged about Genesaris leaving Spain on fake documents, as he was not allowed to leave the country because he had recently been released from prison on parole. The man himself denied this information, stating that he left legally, and Irene acted as his guarantor. Funeral. Without the widower. 12 days after the tragedy, Irene's body was returned to her native Spain. The funeral was conducted with a closed casket, as the remains had begun to decompose after such an extended period. Hundreds attended the funeral: family, friends, neighbors, and even those who didn't personally know Cortez, but had heard about the resonant story and wanted to express their condolences to the family. The only person missing from the farewell ceremony was Farid, who simply feared returning from Colombia, apprehensive of retribution. Farid claimed that the relatives of his late wife had repeatedly threatened him and his elderly mother. For this reason, before flying back to Spain, he intended to appeal to the authorities to ensure his safety. He sought a protective order to be able to attend the funeral, but his request was denied, and Genesaris decided not to take the risk. In turn, Farid filed a complaint in court against the relatives of his deceased wife, who, he alleged, hindered his return home. However, Maria and Pedro Lucas denied his claims, stating they were most interested in his return to face trial in Spain. Additional court proceedings. With new circumstances and accusations against Farid, an additional investigation and court proceedings were conducted. Dario and Carlos, already serving their sentences in a Colombian prison, were interrogated about their acquaintance with Genesaris and a possible premeditated conspiracy. However, Brian categorically denied this assumption. He continued to insist that the murder was an accidental result of a failed robbery attempt. He claimed he had never seen Farid before, let alone been hired as a hitman for his wife. The accusations indeed seemed to be grasping at straws, with no irrefutable evidence of premeditation or a contract killing, only assumptions and interpretations of the events on the recording. Dario also confessed that he was under the influence of alcohol and prohibited substances that evening, hence his poor recollection of the event's chronology. As for Carlos, he maintained that his friend did not involve him in his plans, and everything that happened in the bar was as shocking to him as it was to those they attacked. Blon appeared to be telling the truth, but Brian's words, who made the fatal shot, raised some doubts. Consider this. He failed to commit the robbery, ended up in prison, but his sick child still received the necessary expensive treatment. Brian claimed that kind-hearted people, learning about his motive, helped him. However, the Lucas family's lawyers tried to prove that the €3,000 stolen from Irene, which Farid paid for her murder, were spent on the treatment. Supposedly, Brian agreed to sacrifice himself and go to prison to save his child and secretly pass the money to his wife. This version, however, was never proven. Returned to Spain. Only after obtaining a court order that guaranteed his safety did Genesaris decide to return to Spain. Several months had passed since the tragedy, and the media frenzy had subsided. Upon his return, Genesaris claimed to have brought investigation materials proving his innocence in his wife's murder. He cited his main reason for returning as a desire to care for the children he shared with Irene, who had been under the care of the deceased's relatives during his absence. 6 months later, Farid decided to give a major interview, in which he revealed that he had lost virtually everything. He was jobless, his passport had been annulled, preventing him from leaving the country, and to add insult to injury, his friends had turned their backs on him, and the mother and uncle of his late wife forbade him from seeing his children. Genesaris repeatedly faced Maria and Pedro Lucas in court. He accused them of threatening him while they attempted to prove his involvement in Irene's murder. However, neither side could substantiate their claims. Ultimately, the children remained in the custody of their grandmother and uncle, and the widower was unable to claim any of his late wife's property. Born on April 15, 1952, in Hamilton, Ohio, Donald Harvey was the oldest of 3 children. The boy, with his big brown eyes and curly hair, was lovingly called Donnie by his parents, Ray and Goldie Harvey. Shortly after his birth, the family moved to Boonville, Kentucky, a small community nestled away on the eastern slopes of the Appalachian Mountains. There, Ray worked as a tobacco farmer, while Goldie tended to the children and home. While the couple was struggling from extreme poverty, their marriage began to fall apart. Despite a rocky relationship, they were loving and nurturing to their 3 children. Although Donald was a quiet boy who mostly kept to himself, he apparently had shown no signs of any abnormality. Perhaps the seed of his sadistic and twisted mind was sowed long ago in his past. According to some reports, Donald was abused and assaulted by at least 3 different men between the ages of 4 and 20. One of them was his own uncle on his mother's side. Another one, older neighbor, who offered Donald money at the age of 18. Donald claimed that he was assaulted by his then roommate, Randy White. Though a traumatic past is no excuse for heinous crimes, it might be a point of discussion for psychologists and criminal profilers. In school, Donald always seemed to be a loner and antisocial. He rarely participated in extracurricular activities, opting instead to read books. While this got him good grades, it also earned him a reputation for being the teacher's pet, which led to teasing. Following his graduation from Sturgeon Elementary School, Donald entered Boonville High School in 1968. Despite his good scores, he rapidly became bored with a daily routine, which prompted him to drop out. He later received a diploma from a correspondence school out of Chicago and got his GED the following year at the age of 16. Having no future aspirations, Donald didn't know what he would do with his life at this point. He eventually relocated to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he managed to secure a job at a local factory. Donald was doing well in his job until the work dried up at the plant in 1970, and he was eventually laid off. A few days later, his mother called him and asked him to travel to Kentucky and visit his ailing grandfather, who was recently placed in Nursing Out Hospital in London, Kentucky. He had no idea that agreeing to his mother's request would forever change the course of his life. While visiting his ill grandfather every day, Donald formed a trusting bond with the hospital workers. In fact, they liked him so much that he was offered a job at the hospital. It was here that a terrifying journey of madness and mayhem began, which would go on to last nearly 20 years. Donald's true motive for wanting to work as a nurse's aide might not even be known. However, some people believe that he was desperate to earn money after losing his previous job. He was not a trained nurse or doctor, but the hospital staff had full faith in him. Donald's duties required him to spend hours along with patients, including changing bedpans, inserting catheters, and passing out medications. While looking after the patients was by no means an easy job, Donald's first few weeks at the hospital were uneventful. That is, until one incident with an elderly patient snapped something within him, a disturbing beginning to an unfathomable string of events. It was May 31st, 1970, and Donald was taking care of an 88-year-old stroke victim, Logan Evans. During an evening shift, he walked into a private room to check on the elderly patient, and Mr. Evans rubbed feces in Donald's face. Although the patient was most likely not in his right mind following his stroke, the incident angered Donald so much that he lost all control. The next thing he knew, he was smothering the elderly man with a blue plastic bag and a pillow. Once Evans was motionless, Donald listened to his heart rate with a stethoscope to make sure that he was dead. He then disposed of the plastic bag and cleaned them up, dressing him in a clean hospital gown and showering before notifying the nurses. After this incident, no eyebrows were raised and no questions were asked. I went to fall back to sheet. He covered me in stool within his hand and was smelling to death. That having to do that with a pillow. As a creditor who just got his first taste of blood, Donald's thirst for killing only grew. The very next day, he was looking after another elderly patient, 69-year-old James Tyree. Donald, it seems, used the wrong-sized catheter on him. Tyree initially let him proceed, but then yelled at him to take it out. Donald used the heel of his hand to control him until he vomited blood and died due to an air embolism. Again, no suspicions were raised. As no one detected foul play in his first two murders, Donald became more carefree. Just 3 weeks after committing his first murder, he cut off the oxygen tank of 42-year-old patient Elizabeth Wyatt. This was the beginning of his mercy kill, as he would call his killings later. He claimed he was aware that she was praying to die, and even told him she wished she could die. So he killed her to end her suffering. 4 hours later, a nurse found her dead. Again, no one questioned Donald. Since no one at the hospital became suspicious, Donald saw this as an opportunity to unleash his inner monster. Over the next 10 months, 15 patients died under his care while working at the hospital. Be it pleasure or experimentation, the methods of each murder varied. Smothering, sabotaging oxygen tanks, injecting lethal drugs, overdosing people with medication. It seems he would use almost anything to kill. When angered, his methods became more brutal. On one occasion, after an argument with a patient, Donald snuck into the patient's room and inserted a coat hanger through his catheter, puncturing his bladder and bowel. As a result of the puncture, infection set in, and the man died a few days later. Despite this brutality, Donald always considered these killings to be merciful. The self-proclaimed angel of death wanted to play God with the lives of the vulnerable, cloaking his monstrosities in a warm blanket by giving them the title Mercy Killings. March 31st, 1971, exactly 1 year after his first murder, was the last day Donald worked at Nerrymount Hospital. That evening, he was arrested for a burglary he committed while drunk. In his drunken stupor, Donald incoherently confessed about the murders to the cops, but no one took him seriously. Donald ultimately faced charges of petty theft. Instead of serving prison time, he paid a hefty fine. Although Donald managed to remain free, this incident changed the course of his life for a brief time. For the next few months, Donald tried to get his life back in order and eventually found work as a part-time nurse's aide at Cardinal Hill Hospital in Lexington. In June of 1973, he started a second nursing job at Lexington's Good Samaritan Hospital. He worked both jobs simultaneously until deciding to move on to other positions. Between August 1974 and September 1975, he worked first as a telephone operator in Lexington and then as a clerk at St. Luke's Hospital in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. For some reason, Donald was able to control his urge to kill during this time. It's possible that he simply did not have the same access to the patients as he did at his previous workplace, which could also explain why he shifted from job to job during this time. Despite his efforts to keep his killing urges in check, his inner demons slowly became increasingly more difficult to manage, finally driving him across the state line into Cincinnati, Ohio. In September 1975, Donald moved back to Cincinnati, and within weeks, he started working the night shift at the Cincinnati VA Medical Hospital. He worked there as a nursing assistant, housekeeping aide, cardiac catheterization technician, and autopsy assistant. As he became more comfortable in a hospital setting once again, he started right where he had left off. Since he worked at night, he had very little supervision and unlimited access to all the areas of the hospital. Over the course of the following 10 years, Donald would end up murdering at least 15 patients while working at the hospital. To relish all his crimes, he even kept a detailed diary of his murders and took notes on each victim. These grisly details included sprinkling rat poison in a patient's dessert, pressing a plastic bag and wet towel over the mouth and nose, injecting cyanide into an intravenous tube, adding arsenic and cyanide to orange juice, injecting cyanide into a patient's buttocks, and many more. It is Virgil. Well, the idea of them rat poison was dessert. What kind of dessert? Pillow clean. Fancy put it. I was surprised that I wasn't that with self eggs. And that he turned blamable. But yet the depravity of his crimes did not end there. Throughout his murder spree, Donald was experimenting with different methods based on medical journals he was studying for hints as to how to better conceal his crimes. Cyanide soon became his favorite tool for murder. He'd mix it into the victim's food or pour it directly into their gastric tube. Over the years, he amassed an astounding 30 pounds of cyanide, which he had slowly pilfered from the hospital. He would keep his deadly supply at home for safekeeping. I started using morphine because he wasn't controlled that much in Kentucky, especially in small huff smoke in the 1970s. And I did implode a couple of ventilators. I used cyanide, I used arsenic, I used adhesive planer, a plastic bag tip. Despite all the deaths, Donald Harvey always managed to stay under anyone's radar. He had carefully set up all of his killing to look like accidents or natural causes. Donald even earned himself the nickname the Angel of Death and the Kiss of Death amongst his co-workers. They all thought it was a coincidence that he was always around when these deaths occurred. Little did they suspect that their charming co-worker was a silent creditor. They didn't need any permission, no, but some of the patients didn't have no one to get permission for them. They didn't have a choice, and sometimes there was no family there to make that choice for them, and I made for them. I was being the judge and the jury and executioner. Although years down the line, Donald insisted that his crimes were merely an act of mercy, motivated by compassion. There were other crimes that speak otherwise. The beginning of the 1980s brought out variations in both Donald's life and his crimes. Without a doubt, these crimes were purely driven by rage and revenge. In the early 1980s, Donald briefly began dating a man named Doug Hill. The relationship was challenging from the start, as they argued on a regular basis. After one of those heated fights, Donald retaliated by slipping arsenic into Doug's ice cream. Although he survived, the incident signified the first instance where Donald tried to harm someone outside of the hospital. This was a chilling sign that the monster had begun to stretch his boundaries. Following another fallout with Doug, Donald moved in with another lover, Colonel Howeller, within a short period of time. The relationship was going well in the beginning, before Donald suspected Howeller of cheating on him. Out of jealousy, he would add small doses of arsenic into Hoeller's food so that he would be too ill to leave their apartment. At this point, Donald's acts of revenge were no longer limited to his home or workplace. On one occasion, following an argument, he laced one of the beverages of his female neighbor with hepatitis serum, which nearly killed her before the infection was diagnosed and treated. While luck was on her side, it wouldn't be the same for another of Donald's neighbors, Helen Metzger. The arsenic he put in one of her pies caused her death at a local hospital a week later. Donald's confidence was soaring high after getting away with so many murders. He must have felt invincible. In April 1983, after a tiff with Hoeller's parents, Donald regularly began to poison their food with arsenic in small doses. On May 1, 1983, Hoeller's father, Henry, suffered a stroke and was admitted to Providence Hospital. To complete his unfinished business, Donald placed arsenic in his pudding before leaving during a hospital visit. Sadly, the elderly man died later that night. Donald continued to poison Carl's mother, Margaret, off and on for the next year, but was unsuccessful in his attempts to kill her. In January 1984, Howeller broke up with Donald and asked him to move out. Needless to say, Donald was not happy about it. Unable to accept the rejection, he spent the next 2 years trying to kill his former partner with his poisonous concoctions. As a means of revenge, Donald even went to great lengths in an unsuccessful murder attempt against one of Hoeller's female friends. Though he managed to land Howeller in the hospital at one point, his attempts to eliminate him from the face of the earth had failed. The first cloud of suspicion that loomed over Donald's head was on July 18, 1985, when security guards noticed Donald acting suspiciously and decided to search his gym bag. Inside the haversack, the guards discovered a .38 caliber pistol, hypodermic needles, surgical scissors, gloves, a cocaine spoon, various medical texts, 2 occult books, and a biography of serial killer Charles Sobrage. Fined $50 for carrying a firearm on federal property, Donald was then given the option to quietly resign from his job rather than be fired. Call it a stroke of luck or pure negligence from law enforcement side, none of these ever appeared in his work record, and the hospital authorities did not open an investigation to determine if the man was responsible for any other crimes while working at the hospital. It took Donald 7 months to secure another job at a local hospital. In February of 1986, he started working as a part-time nurse's aide at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati. Unaware of his past and impressed by his performance, his new employers soon offered him a full-time position at the hospital. Before long, Donald settled back into his old routine. Over the next 13 months, Harvey murdered another 26 patients and attempted to kill several more by disconnecting life support machines, injecting air into veins, causing suffocation, and injecting arsenic, cyanide, and petroleum-based cleaners. The 2-decade-long murder spree came to an end with one last murder. On March 7, 1987, a 44-year-old patient, John Powell, mysteriously died. Powell was on life support from a bad motorcycle accident for several months before his demise, but had since started to recover. Due to Ohio's law of a mandatory autopsy for vehicular homicide, this death landed Donald in a situation that he had never faced before. During the autopsy, an assistant coroner noticed the faint scent of almonds, which is a telltale sign of cyanide. Authorities got involved in the death following this concerning discovery. Initially, suspicion fell upon the people closer to Powell, but investigators failed to come up with any evidence or motive pointing toward any of Powell's friends or family members. So, it did not take them long to focus on hospital employees who had access to Powell's room. Donald Harvey was one of those names on the shortlist. To rule out their names, hospital employees at this point were volunteering to take polygraph tests. Donald also volunteered to take a test and even bought a book on how to beat lie detector tests. But eventually, he did not go through with the test and called in sick on the day of his scheduled appointment. If this was not concerning enough, investigators learned about his questionable partner from the VA hospital, as well as his notorious hospital nickname, Angel of Death. Given the numerous unusual deaths that seemed to surround him, authorities began to focus their entire investigation on Donald. He was brought in for questioning. In the initial interrogation phase, Donald denied having anything to do with Powell's murder and portrayed himself as a victim of coincidence. It was only after hours of questioning and playing a bit of good cop, bad cop that he finally confessed to having put cyanide in John Powell's G-tube. He tried to explain that it was because he felt sorry for him and his family. He still denied responsibility for any of the other suspicious deaths. Donald was taken into custody while investigators began to look for other evidence. On August 11, 1987, Donald Harvey, 35 at the time, sat down with investigators and confessed to committing 33 murders over the previous 17 years. The number grew to 70 in total as the days passed. Investigators wanted Donald to be checked for his mental state before his claims were taken to be accurate, as they were doubtful of the numbers Donald provided them. Justice Center sat down with Donald, and I said, "Have you killed more than one person?" And I asked him to tell me how many people was killed. And he said, "You don't understand, I can only estimate." And I told him to, in his mind, pick a number that he knew it could not possibly go beyond. He said 70, following several psychiatric tests by numerous experts. It was determined that Donald knew the difference between right and wrong and was able to conform to the conduct of the law. Hence, he was sane and competent. In November of 1987, Donald Harvey was sentenced to 8 life terms plus 20 years for the murders in Marymount Hospital. In February 1988, he entered guilty pleas on 3 additional Cincinnati homicides and 3 attempted murders, drawing 3 life sentences plus 3 terms of 7 to 25 years. The investigation into the remaining deaths were closed after 2 years, as investigators determined that there was not enough evidence to implicate him in the murders. Whether people were stunned or disgusted by his actions, they definitely were intrigued to know what went on inside his sick mind. In the 1991 interview, a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch asked Donald Harvey about his motive behind the killings. Giving away a rare glimpse inside his mind, Donald said that the reign of terror began with a desire for control. In his eyes, people controlled him for 18 years, and then he controlled his own destiny. He loved the power, and to be able to control whether people lived or died. Even in the world of serial killers, Donald Harvey holds a special place, not only because of his overwhelming kill count, but also because of his choice to kill people he personally knew in addition to his patients. According to an article published on July 23, 2001 by the Associated Press listing the worst serial killers in the United States, Donald Harvey held the #1 place, even surpassing the notorious John Wayne Gacy. While everyone expected Donald Harvey to spend his days behind bars, and unlike his unfortunate victims, die a natural death, destiny had something else in store for him. On March 28, 2017, 64-year-old Donald Harvey was found badly beaten inside his cell in protective custody at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Lucas County. He would die 2 days later at the age of 64 from blunt head trauma due to skull fracture and brain damage. Months after the death, an inmate named James D. Elliott, serving 37 years for numerous burglary offenses, would later write the Toledo Blade and confess to the murder. In those letters, Elliott confessed to punching and stomping on Donald in his cell. He said he grew up in Kentucky near some relatives of Donald's victims and claimed that he committed the crime to give them some closure and peace of mind. Hopefully, everyone from our area will take some solace in the fact that one of their own gave Harvey the punishment that he should have gotten from the courts, Elliot was quoted as writing. In September 2019, Elliot was sentenced to life in prison after pleading guilty to the murder of the infamous Angel of Death. To his last day, Donald Harvey insisted that the majority of his killings were out of mercy. But the truth is, in the process of becoming a murderer from a nurse, Donald appointed himself the judge, jury, and executioner over people's lives. Perhaps because he was not caught for decades, he assumed it was his right to control other people's lives.